Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is when you're watching or listening to this podcast. I'm your host, Paul Weaver. I have the wonderful privilege each week of leading conversations with some of my favorite Bible scholars and Bible expositors. And this week is no exception. I'm pleased to have Dr. Michael Svigel to return to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast to discuss the contents of his soon-to-be released book entitled The Fathers on the Future, subtitled A Second Century Eschatology for the First Century Church. Dr. Svigel is the Department Chair and Professor of Theological Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary. Dr. Svigel earned his bachelor's degree from Philadelphia Biblical University, his Master of Theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, and his Doctor of Philosophy also from Dallas Theological Seminary. Dr. Svigel has written many journal articles and authored, co-authored, and edited many different books, including a series of books in a Exploring Christian Theology series, a book on urban legends of church history, a book on the Shepherd of Hermas, a recently released book called Exploring Christian Scripture, of which I had the privilege to contribute, and, of course, the book we are discussing today, The Fathers on the Future, published by Hendrickson Publishers. Dr. Svigel, welcome back to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Well, I am excited to talk about this book, The Fathers on the Future, and we are recording here at Dallas Theological Seminary in my office here, and thank you for coming upstairs.
Yeah, thanks.
Making the long journey. Well, Dr. Svigel, as I understand it, this book is really the byproduct of your years of teaching a course on eschatology, around 17 years here at DTS, Dallas Theological Seminary, as well as your teaching on the Church Fathers, and you've written on the Church Fathers as well. Tell us a little bit more about your experience and interest in the subject of eschatology and the Church Fathers.
Sure. Yeah, my interest in eschatology and Church Fathers actually began way back in Bible college. I went to Philadelphia College of Bible, now called Cairn University. And I had a midnight job, and I'd get home, and I'd have not enough time to do anything productive and too much time to waste in between there before I had to get to class. So I decided I'd start picking up the Church Fathers and start reading the earliest fathers from the second century. And at the same time, I was wrestling with what do I hold on eschatology? What are my views? It was a pretty strongly premillennial dispensational school, and I was a young punk wanting to, rebel against the teachings of my teachers and strike my own path. And as I was reading through the Didache, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus of Lyon, some of these first, second century fathers, I was actually surprised at how much consonance there was with what I was actually being taught in class in many regards, and especially in the big picture. And so that really sparked my interest both in exploring what is it that the Church Fathers also believed that seems to have they have received from that previous generation, the apostles, and then especially what they believed about eschatology. And so those two interests were parallel for a long, long time. And in the last 15 years or so, as I've had an opportunity to teach both end times eschatology as well as patristics, church fathers, those things continue to intersect in my scholarly endeavors.
Well, I did see in the foreword to the book, or the acknowledgments, or the dedication, you included a few different names there of people that influenced you in this regard.
Correct, yeah. So basically, I went back to the guy who led me to the Lord, Brian Dent, now with the Lord, but kind of set me on that track. And then some of my I won't name all of them, but some of my professors who also challenged me and kind of pushed me in those directions, Charles Ryrie, Jeff Bingham, Craig Blazing, some of these who have had influence on me in either eschatology or patristic studies. I could name several more, but those are the ones that I think have prodded me on in that direction.
And of course, a lot of our listeners have a special interest in Charles Ryrie there, and they know that I've written a book on his life, a short booklet on that. And Was he a professor of yours there at
Yes.
Philadelphia still?
Yeah. And I like to say he's the reason I'm here. He's the one who kind of urged me to go on to academia. He probably saw I would make a terrible pastor, but he had keen insight, and he urged me on and urged me to continue my studies in this direction.
I think students might disagree with that caricature, because I know you have a pastoral heart for them in the classroom. So, but those that may not be familiar with Philadelphia College of the Bible, Cairn University now, pretty well known, famous for a futuristic perspective, and Ryrie was even a president there for a little while.
Yeah, he was, and he was professor here. He was president there for a while, and he continued to adjunct there up until he, in our fields, you have to retire about 3 times before you can stop going to the classroom. But at one point in one of his retirements, he was adjuncting there every semester. So I had an opportunity to take a couple classes with him.
So how old would you have been back then?
Oh, my goodness. Early 20s.
Okay. So I was 18 when he was still teaching for Word of Life
Word of
Bible
Life.
Institute. And he would come up and teach eschatology to 18-year-olds. So So I had him as an 18-year-old. Well, very good. Dr. Svigel, in the first chapter of your book entitled Putting Eschatology Back in Its Place, you discuss a couple of the challenges as it relates to the study and teaching of eschatology. But then you argue that there is a need for a book of this kind. Would you elaborate further?
Sure. So what I do kind of up front is acknowledge what everybody knows. There are a lot of self-published and self-promoted works on eschatology, especially popular level end times books that are usually done by people who aren't, how do I say this nicely, not particularly qualified to do so. I'm sure you get them mailed to you. Please adopt this as your textbook for your Revelation class. And they're not really good. I call them the hacks. But then you also have quacks out there that have set dates for Christ's return, billboards. I remember we've been through several cycles of those ourselves, even in the last 20 years. And it seems like every 5 years or so, somebody's setting a date or pointing to somebody saying this is the Antichrist. So that has put eschatology in a bad light. So you start talking about end times events, and they put you in that category. So I'm trying to push back against that. But that has also resulted in what I call eschatological agnosticism, end times agnosticism. I don't know what I believe about that. It doesn't matter, and I'm not going to take any time to work it out. And so I want to kind of pull us back and say, look, there are some things. First of all, there are things we all agree on, which are really important to the Christian faith and the Christian hope. And then we can have a mature, reasoned, biblical, theological, historical discussion on some of these details. And that's what I'm trying to do. Take a fresh perspective. I try to be ironic. I'm not trying to make enemies here. People aren't going to agree with everything in the book, but I am trying to start and continue a more friendly conversation than what has been done in the past.
Couple thoughts. So you're not opposed to popular level writing in any way. It's just, in fact, that's what Ryrie and Walvoord and others were well known for, was being able to take difficult concepts and making it available to the popular level. But it was always usually done judiciously and carefully. Right.
And so again, I want to make clear, I hope to in the future write something at a more popular level on eschatology. But as you know, in our futurist, premillennial circles, there have been a lot of those. So they do a pretty good job of making that accessible. And what we haven't had in the last for a long time is a comprehensive, sustained defense of a futurist premillennial eschatology at an academic level. So I thought that's the gap that really needed to be filled.
Yep, and I agree, and I appreciate you doing this work. The Fathers on the Future, and it's much more than just the Fathers, right? You
Correct.
have a lot of exegetical work on the main
It's probably
passages.
mostly exegetical. So I like to say I take a Berean approach. I say, here's what the Fathers were asserting roughly in the 2nd century. Let's go to Scripture and see if these things are true. And that's kind of the approach. Here's what they said, and I think there are a few things where I have to say, well, it doesn't quite line up with what we know Scripture to be saying, but those are some minor points. For the most part, I show they actually converge, and I think it demonstrates that they are faithfully receiving not just the Scriptures from the apostles, but the general theology, eschatology from those apostles as that 2nd and 3rd generation.
So I do want to encourage everyone grab this book, even if it's a little challenging for you. It can be read and understood. I think anyone that is careful and is willing to, it's not bedtime reading though, right?
Yeah, you do have to invest a little, some gray matter into it, but it is written at what I call an intermediate level. There is Greek and Hebrew and Latin and some different things in there, but they're in parentheses, and I'm pretty careful to try to, I think you can skip those words without missing what the point is. I do want to point out, too, that it does go into some really detailed advanced work on online excurses. So there are additional resources online with a QR code. So that allows me to keep the book at an intermediate level and then have advanced treatments on things that scholars and critics will be interested in.
The time we're recording this, it's not been released yet. What's the release date?
First week in November.
Okay.
So if you're listening to this in November, it's available.
Yes. So if it's not available yet, you can pre-order it, right?
Correct.
Why does it matter what the early church fathers think about eschatology or the future things?
Yeah. So part of the assumption, I'm coming at this, and I'm very clear in the first chapter. One of my presuppositions as a Orthodox Protestant evangelical Christian is that Scripture is inspired and inerrant. It is the final authority in all matters of faith and practice. So all of our theology has to be built ultimately on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. But as you know, the question is, how do we interpret these things right? And on some of the details, we're just going to have to suspend judgment on some passages. They're very difficult to understand. Peter himself said this. But the assumption is they're the foundation. What they taught and what they wrote is the faith once for all delivered to the saints. So the question then is, how do those apostolic first century teachings regarding especially big picture issues regarding to end times, how do those echo into the next second and third generation? Part of the assumption is that the apostles and prophets and these early teachers were pretty good teachers, that they were able to, for the most part, pass this faith on to the next generation and that to the next, 2 Timothy 2:2. So what you do see is a very clear, consistent, stable, coherent eschatology on big picture things. And that becomes then sort of the starting point in saying, look, it looks like this is so widespread and early and foundational, well-developed, that they must have gotten this from their previous generation of the apostles. And then, like I said before, the Berean approach, let's go back to Scripture and see, is this really the best way to read this, or did this early church completely get it wrong? And I show they actually cohere very well. The best exegesis and the best history are pointing in the same direction. So that's why it's another lens, or maybe better, another light to shine on how are we reading Scripture in its actual historical, theological context.
Very good. And for those, we did do a series of episodes with Dr. Varner on the church fathers, and that's a great conversation. Remind our listeners that maybe aren't familiar with, or apostolic fathers. Even this title might be confusing to some.
Yeah, so the church fathers, it's a huge span, going from about 100 to 600 AD. But there's a subset called the apostolic fathers. Apostolic, not meaning they're apostles, but they are disciples, or at least in that very next generation that would have overlapped with the apostles themselves. So written by people who knew the apostles or should have. So those are writings like, as probably Dr. Varner mentioned, Didache, the so-called Epistle of Barnabas, even though Barnabas' name is not on it, but First Clement, Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp of Smyrna, some of these people. And then their students would be Irenaeus of Lyon, who figures prominently in here because he wrote so much on eschatology, Justin Martyr, and some of these other figures from the mid to later 2nd century. Those are the people I'm primarily looking at.
Hello, friends. I want to take just a few moments of your time to share with you a quick prayer request for Jill and myself. Jill and I have been thinking and praying about how to get the Bible and Theology Matters podcast to the next level in terms of ministering to more people and being more effective. Currently, my wife and I are the bottleneck, limiting our effectiveness. We are a two-man show. We're doing all the planning, all the recording, all the editing, and social media posts. Not because we think we're the best at it. And not because we want to per se, but simply because of financial constraints. We simply don't have the financial giving at this point to contract out the editing or social media work. The Bible and Theology Matters podcast is not making money, nor is that our goal. Our goal is to have the greatest influence we can for the glory of God with good Bible and theology, because we are 100%